Um, so I'm just going to have this visual up behind me while I speak. It's a sort of detailed shot from one of the more recent installations of Bernadette Mayer's installation Memory. I think this is from Canada Gallery in 2015. Right. So what I'm going to present today is part of an ongoing research project. It's my doctoral dissertation, which begins with the proposition that Bernadette Mayer is a kind of filmmaker. So while there's been a lot of useful work in recent years around her contributions to contemporary art, I think there are aspects of her practice that film may better account for. For example, that her major projects from the 1970s all have a temporal structure. So you have Memory, which is 1 month, Studying Hunger Journals, which is around 3 years, Midwinter Day, 1 day, and The Desire of Mothers to Please Others in Letters, which is 9 months. And if we look at the Memory installation, which is a sequence of over 1,000 photographs accompanied by 6 hours of audio, we can also see that relationships between image, sound, and duration are also in play. There's a wealth of anecdotal and biographical evidence which suggests the influence of cinema, from Mayer's admiration of Jean-Luc Godard and Agnes Varda and the experimental films of NNYSS, to the fact that her partner at the time that she made Memory was a filmmaker, Ed Bowes. There's also her well-known but unfortunately lost video experiments with Bowes and Clark Coolidge. And she also worked as an assistant editor on an unreleased film on the trial of the Chicago 7. So while all this helps make the case, I think, for considering Mayer's work in relation to cinema, I want to take a slightly different angle here by offering some key questions that are historically posed by film theory that are also taken up in Memory and arguably all of her durational works. I've divided these into sort of 4 provisional categories or cinematic logics. They overlap and I think contradict each other in some ways, but I think they help to suggest what looking at Mayer's writing through the lens of cinema might afford. So the first logic is cinema as storage. So one problem that cinema has dealt with since its beginnings is that of its relationship to time. Is time objective or subjective, continuous or discontinuous? Does cinema store time or produce it? Cinema stores the rhythms and temporalities of capitalist production. At least this is film theorist Marianne Doan's argument in her book, The Emergence of Cinematic Time. Doan stresses that early cinema, viewed as a record of pure time, materialized archival desires that accompanied the growing sense of fragmentation and contingency associated with modernity, and an experience of time as increasingly abstract and rationalized, as in labor time. Cinema's capacity, on the one hand, to record the ephemeral and archive presence, and on the other, to restore the continuity of lived time, became the guarantee that anything and everything is filmable, or, in terms that Doan herself does not use, that anything and everything could become a value form. So in the Coda to Memory, Mayer talks about an archival desire, quote, to leave all out to include all. Interestingly, that coda wasn't included in the 2020 reprint. But this ambivalent desire continued to preoccupy her throughout the 1970s. It appears again and again throughout her work, most notably, I think, in Midwinter Day, where she uses almost the exact same phrase. And there are arguably several ways that her work engages the storage of time, but for now, I just want to suggest, following Doan, that as archives of time, her books respond not only to the transformations of capitalist production taking place around 1971, but also the transformations taking place in the sphere of reproduction, or social reproductive labor. All right, so the second logic that I want to sort of proposed today is the cinema as a brain. So does cinema take place in the minds of spectators? Is the film a mental projection? Is consciousness essentially cinematic? But in an early poem from around 1970, The Complete Works of Webern, a movie, Mayer writes, "A screen acts as a mind, or is it a mind that acts as a 1 minute, 45 seconds? So Mayer seems to be asking herself similar questions at around the time that she made Memory. Interestingly, this line also evokes Gilles Deleuze's famous motto, "The brain is the screen." Deleuze meant that cinema inscribes itself physiologically on the brain, that it works on like electrochemical and affective, which is to say, non-signifying registers. But to paraphrase Patricia Pisters, who also sort of takes her starting point in Deleuze, to paraphrase her account of what she calls the neuroimage, throughout film history, we go from following characters to seeing through their eyes to experiencing their mental states directly. And Mayer saw the memory installation as a kind of window onto her mind. And she thought that viewers would, through the combination of image and sound, actually be able to understand what it was like to be her. So, kind of considering this and also her long-standing interest in brain function, the logic of the cinema as brain seems to offer at least some explanatory power. Cinema as mirror. So this logic has to do with questions surrounding identity, representation, and the gaze. So who's looking and who's being looked at, who is desiring, who is being desired, who are we, or who do we become when we watch a film? Apparatus theory was a dominant strand within film theory during the 1960s and 70s. Drawing on psychoanalytic thought, it proposed to rethink mainstream cinema as a kind of mental machine that generates pleasure for spectators who, according to Christian Metz's reading of the Lacanian mirror stage, come to identify with film images through a process of misrecognition. And since, for Lacan, the mirror stage also marks a passage into the symbolic order of language, questions surrounding the cinema as mirror are also, to an extent, those of signification. The feminist film criticism of the 1970s and 80s problematized apparatus theory's reliance on a phallocentric psychoanalytic schema where women are fixed in the imaginary register and denied access to the symbolic. In Marianne Doan's words, "Woman finds herself in a kind of signifying limbo. She has no autonomous symbolic representation." So, as a kind of feedback loop of word and image, Memory arguably literalizes these tensions between the imaginary and the symbolic, the gaze and inscription. And there's a lot more to say here, but perhaps we can revisit this particular logic during the discussion. So finally, there's cinema as science. Though from its beginning, cinema has had a strong connection to the laboratory and the clinic. For example, Hugo Münsterberg, who is widely considered one of the first film theorists, based his theory of film on experiments in applied psychology that he conducted as a director of the Harvard Psychology Lab, where, incidentally, he was one of the supervisors of young Gertrude Stein. So while this history is clearly of interest to the issues of gender and modes of production already mentioned, I want to focus on Mayer's description of memory as a, quote, emotional science project. So, arguably, I argue this, there's a sense in which Mayer's work, as a work of emotional science, approaches film critic Annette Mickelson's notion of cinema as a form of epistemological inquiry, that is, as an exploration of the known and the knowable, and a medium that can generate new knowledge. So, as some of you have probably already noticed, Several of the questions that I put forward here today are also posed by psychoanalysis that contested science of the archive, in Derrida's phrase, that emerged at roughly the same time as cinema at the end of the 19th century. So as a final thought, I just want to suggest that what a cinematic lens seems to show is that psychoanalysis is inscribed in Mayer's work in ways that are perhaps more significant and complex than has been previously acknowledged. And I think that's my 10 minutes. So, thank you.